and welcome. In this course, you'll learn all about WordPress development. By the end of this course, you'll have a solid understanding of WordPress. WordPress is a very powerful CMS and currently powers over 10 million websites from around the world. Its popularity is due to the fact that you can create any kind of website that you'd like. You can create a simple blog out of the box, or you can create a full-blown social network. By taking this course, you'll learn how to customize your WordPress site by creating custom plugins and/or themes. Here's an overview of what you'll learn. For themes, you'll learn how to make WordPress recognize your theme with file headers, make your theme flexible with options in the admin dashboard, display posts, pages, and even work with custom post types, create widget areas, use WordPress's translation system, and so much more. When we start working on plugins, you'll learn how to make WordPress recognize your plugin with file headers, create custom post types through action hooks, work with taxonomies, query the database with various APIs, create your own widgets and shortcodes, make your plugin translate ready, and so much more. WordPress comes with over 10 different APIs, and you'll learn how to use most of them by the end of this course. The great thing about WordPress is that all APIs are available to you whether you're working on themes or plugins. So the things you learn while creating themes can also be applied to plugins and vice versa. We'll take a deeper look at this as the course progresses. Some additional things we'll be covering is licensing, selling your themes and plugins, working with third-party APIs, AJAX requests, and a whole lot more. So you may be asking, what are the requirements for this course? Well, you'll need a good understanding of PHP, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, a good local server to work on, a text editor of your choice, and a healthy thirst for learning. We will mainly focus on working with WordPress's built-in API, so we will not be covering most of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. WordPress doesn't require you to learn any special HTML, CSS, or JavaScript code. As you'll learn, WordPress is extremely flexible on the front end. I will provide you with a static HTML design that we will convert into a WordPress theme. You are free to use your own design. Now, you may be wondering who I am and why you should trust me as your instructor. My name is Jack, and I've been a WordPress developer for over 5 years now. I've helped several businesses with their WordPress sites by creating custom plugins and themes. I even sell my own plugins on Code Canyon. I've learned all the ups and downs of WordPress. I will help you avoid some of the mistakes I've made over the past few years and teach you the best practices for WordPress development. I hope I've convinced you to take this course and make you into a great WordPress developer. First things first, we need to set up an environment we can work on. If you already have one set up, then feel free to skip this part of the lecture. You can use whatever environment suits you the best. The only requirement is that it should allow you to install and use WordPress. If you're on a Mac, you can use a program called MAMP. If you're on Windows, then you have quite a few options. The two most popular solutions available are XAMPP and WAMP. I find that WordPress is compatible with either, and there is no advantage to use either one for WordPress, so it's all about preference. I prefer to use WAMP, so that's what I'll be using. If you want to use WAMP, then follow along with me. Open up the browser of your choice and navigate to wampserver.com. Scroll down and you'll find the download section. Once downloaded, you can now run the installer with its default configuration. I already have WAMP installed, so I will not be going through the installation. In your startup menu, you'll see something called Start WAMP Server. Click this and now you'll see a W icon appear in your icon tray. Click on this and you will be provided with quite a few options. It isn't necessary to know what all this does, as we're fine with most of the default settings. There is one thing we need to do. Under Apache Modules, search for something called rewrite_module and turn it on. It's very important this to be on. This module basically makes sure that our server supports WordPress custom permalinks. It just makes our URLs easier to read and understand. Not necessarily required, but it is very helpful. Alright, let's begin installing WordPress. Go to wordpress.org and then download the latest version of WordPress. You'll find a fairly small zip file that contains all of WordPress. If you open it up, you'll find a list of files, but you won't have to deal with most of this. WAMP provides a folder where all our code should be placed. To find this folder, click on the green icon again and click the option www directory. Inside this directory, I want you to create a folder named Udemy. Drag and drop the contents of the WordPress zip file into this directory. Before running the installation, we need to set up a database. Click on the WAMP icon and then click on phpMyAdmin. Click on Databases and in the Create New Database form, enter a name for your database. I'm going to call this Udemy. The collation should be UTF-8 _ general _ CI. The collation is basically the character set that this database will be using. There are hundreds of sets, but this kind of stuff is beyond the scope of this lecture. WordPress recommends UTF General CI as it allows us to accept a wide variety of characters. Click on Create and you should now have a new empty database. The next step is to install WordPress. You can find the installation by opening up your browser and typing localhost/Udemy. The language will be English. If you speak another language, by all means, select your preferred language. WordPress is now telling us that it needs to set up a configuration file that connects to our database. Fill in the fields with your database information. Host should be localhost. The database name will be Udemy. The username will be root and the password will be left empty. This user is created for us by default by WAMP. Leave the prefix as is. You can change it if you like it though. All it does is create the database tables with a prefix of our choosing. So for example, if there was a table named posts, then WordPress will prefix that table with WP_ and the new name of the table will be WP_ posts. Now you can submit the form. You should now see a success message similar to mine. Next part of the installation is just some information about your site. Site title, Udemy. Username, set your username to whatever you like. Since I'm working on a local host, I'm going to keep it simple and set this to admin. Password, I'm also going to make this admin. Email, input any email. This field actually won't work because we don't have an SMTP server set up, so I'm going to set this to admin@admin.com. Allow search engines to index this site. Turn this off since we're on a local machine. Submit this form and you should now see a success message. You can now log in with the credentials you just set a few seconds ago. You'll be taken to the WordPress admin dashboard. That's it. Congrats. The final step is to set up the permalink structure. Go to Settings, Permalinks, and set the structure to post name. This will make our URL simple and easy to read. That's it. We can now begin coding. We're going to start things off by creating a theme. As I stated previously, this course does not focus on most of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript provided to you. This is because WordPress is very flexible when it comes to developing themes. With that said, I already have a static template ready. You can download this template in the resources section of this lecture. This template was built with Bootstrap with some customizations. I've done nothing to this template that makes it WordPress ready. I will walk you through every step to convert it from a static template into a WordPress theme. If you have a template already, then feel free to use it. Let's take a look at some of the pages. Let's open up the home page. We have our menu that contains our site name, menu items, and some social network icons. We also have this blog page which will contain all of our posts and some pagination. This is a very simple and clean template, but don't let that fool you. We're going to make this theme very flexible. Now that we have an idea of what we're going to create, it's time to start creating a theme. Inside the WordPress installation, navigate to WP Content, Themes. This is where all our theme files will be placed. We want to keep our themes separated from the rest of the themes, so create a new folder called Udemy. In the text editor of your choice, open up this folder and create two files. The first file is style.css and the second file is index.php. These are the only two files required by a WordPress theme. The style.css file is where we'll place our file header information. A file header is just a comment block placed at the very top of the style CSS file that describes our theme. Let's open up this file and create a file header. In the resources section, I provide a link to more information about the file header. This site is the official WordPress codex. You can find a lot of helpful information about WordPress development here. I highly suggest you bookmark it. So the file header is a block comment placed at the top of the file that has meta information about a theme or plugin. Scroll down to the theme file header example section. Copy and paste this into the style.css file. I'm going to actually remove most of this info except the theme name. Change this value to Udemy. That's it. This is the absolute minimum requirements for a theme. Go to your WordPress admin dashboard and navigate to Appearances, Themes. You should now see an empty block with the name Udemy. You can actually activate this theme and start using it. If you did everything right, then you should see no errors. Let's go to the front end of the site. You will see an empty page. However, WordPress throws no errors because we did everything required. If you take a look at the source code, you will find WordPress added absolutely nothing because that's our theme's job. As you can see, WordPress gives you complete control over your theme. Open up the index.php file and add the text, "Hello World." Refresh the front-end page and you will now see it outputted. Pretty simple, huh? WordPress is very smart and will automatically load this file without us having to write any logic. The index.php file can be thought of as the default template for WordPress. There are various templates we can create, but we'll cover that later. Let's go back to the file header in the style.css file. I'm going to re-add the meta information we previously removed. Let's go over this one by one. The theme URI is a link where users can view where your theme can be found officially. I'm going to remove this piece of information. Feel free to keep it or remove it as well. The author is the name of the creator of this theme. This can be your own personal name, or if you're on a team, then the name of your team. I'm going to set this to Jack. The author URI is the URL to your own personal site or a URL to your team's site. I'm going to set this to jascocoin.com as this is my personal site. The description is a brief summary about your theme. Let's set this to a simple bootstrap WordPress theme. The version is the current version of this theme. Since this is a brand new theme, we'll be setting this to 1.0. You can use whatever version schema you want. WordPress doesn't force you to stick to a certain version schema. The license is simply the name of the license you'll be using. I'm going to leave this as is for now. We'll be going over licenses later in the course. The license URI is the URL to where the user can find more information about the theme's license. The tags is a comma-separated list of words that describe your theme. This piece of information is used by WordPress's theme repository to help users find your theme. If you plan on uploading your theme to wordpress.org, then setting this piece of information is important. Let's set this to Bootstrap, Responsive, Flat, Simple, Mobile Ready. The last property we can set is the text domain. The text domain is very important when it comes to translating our theme. You can think of the text domain as a unique ID for our translations. It's common practice to set the text domain to the same name as your folder. In our case, we're going to set it to Udemy. I promise you we'll be going more over what the text domain does and its role in WordPress development. For now, just know if you want to make your themes or plugins translate ready, then set the text domain to something unique. There's also this small bit of text. You do not have to add this bit of information. Authors usually use this space to add in more info about the theme, such as license info or developer notes. WordPress will not bother scanning this part of the file, so you don't have to worry about it. I'm going to remove this bit. Let's go back to the themes admin page and you will now see some of our information displayed. As you can tell so far, WordPress handles a lot for us. If you'd like to know more about file headers, then I highly suggest you read the codex page I provided earlier. There's one last thing I want to do before I end this lecture. While not required, WordPress will search for a file called screenshot.png. This file is basically a screenshot of your theme that will be displayed in the admin side of WordPress. In the resources section, I provide a screenshot you can use for our theme. Upload it to the theme directory and you can now refresh the themes admin page. You will now see our screenshot being displayed. You can create your own screenshot if you'd like. The recommended size for a screenshot is 880 pixels by 660 pixels. Right now all we have is a hello world message as our theme. It's not very flexible nor does it look appealing. Let's change that. Earlier I asked you to download the static version of our theme. Open up that file. In our themes folder, let's create a subfolder called Assets. Unzip the contents of the static template into this folder. I'm also going to add the HTML in there as well so we can use it for reference throughout this course. It's important to note that WordPress doesn't require to have this folder or file structure. The only files WordPress needs are the index.php and style.css files. The folder structure is completely up to you. Let's open up the index.html file. Copy and paste its contents into the index template. Obviously this won't work, but it's a good starting point. If you refresh the home page, you'll notice the site is pretty broken. If you press F12 on your keyboard, you'll open up the developer tools for either Google Chrome or Firefox. You can then click on the console tab and you'll see that we're getting all these 404 errors. These errors appear because the style sheets and scripts that our template needs can't be found. We could edit the index template and fix the links to point to the new paths for our theme, but this isn't efficient or recommended. We run into a couple of problems such as users can actually change the default WordPress folder structure to suit their needs, rendering our fixed links useless. We would have to check if SSL is enabled and uses HTTPS or HTTP. You'll end up loading all style sheets and scripts on every page, even if we don't need them. If you want to, you can create the logic for this, but you don't have to because WordPress actually handles this logic for us. It's something WordPress calls action hooks. I'll explain what those are in just a moment. Back inside our themes folder, create a new file called functions.php. This file is completely optional, but if you have it, then WordPress will automatically load this file and execute any code within this file. You don't have to do anything to set it up. The functions file can be thought of as your theme's logic. If you would like to query the database, add style sheets, process forms, check if a user is logged in, then this is the file you'll want to edit. I personally don't like to stuff my functions file with all my logic. I like to have structure and separate everything into its own file. So let's add some comments. We'll first create a section for variables or functions that must be available throughout our theme. The second section will be for including any files. The third section will be for any filters and action hooks. We'll discuss hooks very soon. Lastly, we'll create a section for shortcodes. Keep in mind, you don't have to structure your file like this. This is just how I do it and how I recommend you do it. Just to make sure everything is working, let's echo out a hello world message. If you refresh your page, you should see our message outputted onto the home page. Let's remove this because it's no good practice to echo out anything in the functions file. A lot can happen throughout WordPress, and using conditional statements to check when a certain action happens isn't very efficient. We would have a lot of nested code. Instead, there's something called hooks. The hooks API is a way for you to listen to an event and execute code when that event happens. An event can be anything. There are literally over 100 different hooks. There's a hook for the footer or when an admin form is submitted. There's Ajax hooks and so much more. We won't be going over all of them because it would just be too overwhelming. If you don't understand, don't worry. You'll see how it works in just a moment. We will definitely be going over some of the most commonly used ones though. In the resources tab of this lecture, you'll find a link to the hooks API. Let's check this out. You'll notice that there's a list for two kinds of hooks, action hooks and filter hooks. We'll be going over both of these throughout this course. Let's take a look at the list of action hooks available. Scroll around this page. You'll see all the hooks available to us. I know we haven't gone over how to use hooks yet, but just from looking at this list, do you think you can spot the hook we need in order to add scripts and styles to our theme? Most people would say WP_head, but this is incorrect. The correct hook is the one above it, which is WP_onQ_scripts. Click on it and let's take a look at this hook. This is what WordPress has to say about it. WP_onQScripts is the proper hook to use when onQing items that are meant to appear on the front end. Despite the name, it is used for onQing both scripts and styles. Just by reading that, you know it is indeed the correct hook to use when adding scripts and styles. Alright, so let's get started with using action hooks. Open up your functions file and under the hooks section, add the following code. add underscore action, open parentheses, apostrophe, WP underscore onQ underscore scripts, apostrophe, comma, apostrophe, JU underscore onQ, apostrophe, close parenthesis, semicolon. The add action function is a function that WordPress automatically creates and loads for you. You don't need to do anything to make sure it's available to you. This function has 4 parameters, but only the first 2 are required. The first parameter is the name of the hook you want to access. In our case, we want to access the WP onQ scripts hook. Make sure you input this as a string. The second parameter is the name of the function you want to call when this hook is called. The other 2 parameters we'll be discussing in another lecture. For now, we only need the first 2. Currently, we don't have this function defined, so we'll get an error. Let's fix that quickly. As I stated before, I don't like to add all my logic and code in one file. So let's create a folder called includes. Within this folder, create another folder called front. The front folder will contain any code and logic pertaining to the front end of our site. Within this folder, create a file called onq.php. Let's create the function we called from our action hook. Great, we're almost done. Now, we need to include this file. So let's go back to the functions file and under the include section, include the onQ file. I'm using the get template directory function to make sure we always get the correct path to this file. This function simply returns the absolute path to the current activated theme. Just like the add action function, you do not need to do anything to make this function available to you. It is already loaded and created for you beforehand. WordPress takes care of that for you. I'll be using this function whenever we include files. If we did everything correctly, we should be able to refresh our page without any errors. Since we have no errors, that means we did everything correctly. One last thing before I wrap up this lecture. You'll notice I named my onQ function JU_onQ. I prefixed our function with some initials. It's common practice to prefix your classes and functions with the initials of your theme or name. Throughout this course, I'll be prefixing JU_ for every function. The J is for my name Jack, and the U is for the name of this theme, Udemy. We do this because we don't want to run into any naming conflicts with other plugins. In our next lecture, we'll take a look at adding styles to our pages through this hook. Let's take a look at how to add styles through our hook. It's pretty straightforward. There are only 2 steps required to add styles to our pages. The first step is to register our style. Registering styles simply means that you're telling WordPress that you have a style sheet and you would like WordPress to know its location along with other details. In the resources section of this lecture, I provide a link to learn all about registering styles. In order to register a style, use the WP_register_style function. Under the usage section, you'll see we're using this function correctly because it says, use the WP onQ scripts action to call this function. Calling it outside of an action can lead to problems. Since we're already doing that, it's safe to assume we can use this function. This function has 2 required parameters. The first parameter is the handle name. The handle name can be thought of as a unique name or ID for reference. The second parameter is the source to the style sheet. Let's go back to the onQ function and use this function. Alright, so let's call the WP register style function and let's pass in a handle for the first parameter. If we go back to the index template, you'll see we have 4 style sheets being loaded. The first style sheet is Bootstrap. So let's just call this handle JU_Bootstrap. Just like functions, it's also common practice to prefix our handles with some initials. For the second parameter, let's pass in the source. There's actually a function that will always point to the current themes directory. This makes it easier on us as we don't have to perform checks if the owner of the site changed the names of the themes directory. This function is called get_template_directory_URI. You do not have to pass in anything and you don't have to include any files to get this function to work. This function is loaded and created for you by WordPress. You may notice this function is similarly named to the getTemplateDirectory function. The difference between these 2 functions is the URI version will actually get the web URL. The non-URI version gets the system path. The other parameters aren't really needed for a theme, so we won't be going over them. However, feel free to take a look at them and mess around with it. That's it. If we refresh our page, you'll notice that this won't work just yet. We've only registered our style. Now we must tell WordPress we would like to add it to our page. We now have to use a function called wp_onQ_style. I've also included a link to this function in the resources section of this lecture. This function only has one required parameter, which is the handle name of the style we registered earlier. You'll notice the other parameters are similar to the WP register style function. However, these are only available just in case you forget to register a style. You should always register a style though. The difference between registering and unqueuing a file is that register will tell WordPress about a style sheet and make it available to be called later on, while unqueuing will instruct WordPress to load our style sheets onto the page. You will not always want to unqueue a style on every page, as it isn't always efficient. There's also plugins out there that will sometimes scan registered styles and perform actions such as minifying or combining style sheets together. So it's best to register first, then unqueue. Let's unqueue the Bootstrap style sheet. Right after registering, let's call the function wp_unqueueStyle and pass in the handle name ju_bootstrap. Alright, we're almost done, I promise. There's only one last thing we need to do in order for all of this to work. If we go back to the index template, you'll notice we haven't told WordPress where to load our style sheets. Our template is pure HTML. Let's change that. Go to the head section of our template and right after the title tag, call the function wp_head. The wp head function is a function defined by WordPress. This function simply tells WordPress this is the spot where themes and plugins can unqueue their style sheets and script files. Let's refresh our page and we should see some of it working. If you see something similar to what I see, then you're good to go. Let's wrap up this lecture by adding the rest of our styles. Here's what I want you to do. Pause the video and add the rest of your style sheets. Alright, so now that you're back, you should have something similar to what I have on my screen. You'll also notice that we were using two Google font sets called Roboto and Roboto Mono. Since these are hosted outside of our site, I didn't use the getTemplateDirector URI function. I just pasted in the direct URL that Google provides. Lastly, I edited the index template and removed any reference to these sheets since we're doing this the WordPress way. Let's go to our home page and open up the console. You'll notice we get a lot of errors, but we'll fix these soon. What I want you to look for is any 404 errors related to style sheets. If you don't see any, then that means you loaded everything correctly. Awesome! Our site is starting to look pretty cool. Let's talk about adding scripts in the next lecture. Adding a script file is almost the same as adding a style sheet. However, unlike style sheets, we can load script files in the footer. If we take a look at our template, we have two files being loaded in the header and a few other scripts being loaded into the footer. Just like adding files inside the head tag, we also have to call a function from the footer to instruct WordPress where to load the files in the footer. At the very bottom of our template, right before the closing body tag, call the WP footer function. This function allows our theme and other plugins to load their files into the footer. Alright, now that we have that set up, let's go to our unqueue function and start adding our scripts. Just like style sheets, we have to register our scripts. In the resources section of this lecture, I provide a link to the WP register script function. Let's take a look at what WordPress has to say about this function. As you can see, only the first two parameters are required and they're basically similar to the WP register style function. In the index template, we include a script called fastclick. Let's add this script to our head through our unqueue function. So let's call the WP register script function and pass in a handle name. The handle name will be ju_fastclick. The second parameter is the source. Just like last time, we'll be using the WP template directory URI function. Lastly, just append the actual path relative to the themes directory, which is assets, vendor, fastclick, fastclick.js. The next step is to unqueue the script. The function that allows us to do this is the WP unqueue script function. All it needs is the handle name we registered in our script earlier. So let's call it and pass it the handle name. If we did everything right, we should be able to refresh our page and see it loaded onto the page without any errors. Great. Let's also register modernizer and unqueue it. Make sure to remove these tags from the head tag as well. Now, in most cases, you always want to load your scripts in the footer to allow our content to be loaded before our scripts. So how do we make our scripts load in the footer? Let's go back to the WordPress codex and take a look at the WP register script function again. You'll notice that the fifth parameter determines whether or not a script is loaded in the footer. By default, it doesn't. We have to pass in a true Boolean value so that we can load scripts in the footer. So let's take a look at our index template and let's load the bootstrap file first. Bootstraps depends on jQuery, but we won't be registering jQuery, and I'll explain in a moment why. In our unqueue function, let's call the WP register script. Like before, pass it in a handle name of ju_bootstrap. Don't worry about this conflicting with the style handle name. Style and script handle names are kept separate, so there won't be any conflicting issues. Let's pass in the source assets scripts bootstrap.min.js. The third parameter is this script's dependencies. In some cases, your script will depend on the functionality of another script. You have to pass in an array of handle names for WordPress to make sure those scripts are loaded first before this one. In our case, we don't have to worry about dependencies, so we'll just pass in an empty array. The fourth parameter is the version of the script. If you update your script frequently, this can be a useful parameter to set. This is because a lot of WordPress sites have cache enabled. By updating the version, you'll force WordPress to load the latest version of this script. I'm going to set this to false, as I don't really need to worry about versioning for this script. The whole point of this part of the lecture is to load the script in the footer, which is the fifth and final parameter. All you have to do is pass in true. That's it. Let's unqueue Bootstrap and see if it loads on our page. WordPress also loads its top nav bar for users who are logged in. After confirming that it loads, why don't you pause the video and load the rest of our scripts? Alright, so I basically just registered and unqueued the rest of our scripts. You'll notice that I also removed their inclusions from the footer. If I refresh our page, you'll see that everything is loaded correctly except for one thing, jQuery. We also get a couple of errors in our console saying that jQuery isn't loaded or defined. In our unqueue file, I didn't bother registering or even unqueuing it, but why? Let's go to the WordPress codex and take a look at the WP register script function. In the contents sidebar, I want you to click number 6, handles and their script paths registered by WordPress. You'll be taken to a part of the page that tells you that WordPress already registers jQuery. WordPress actually registers a large number of scripts. A lot of them are commonly used by WordPress developers, libraries like jQuery UI and underscore. If we scroll down long enough, you'll find jQuery. So all we have to do is unqueue this script before unqueuing anything else. Let's do this now. Refresh your page, and if you did everything right, then you should see any errors related to the jQuery are gone. Now, before I end this lecture, I want to say one very important thing. Never ever override WordPress's default scripts, including jQuery. There are some developers out there that like to include their own version of jQuery, which may seem great and all, but it's not really a good idea. You aren't the only developer using jQuery. If developers constantly use their own versions of scripts, this could break a client's site and cause hours of debugging. It's so much better to just use a jQuery version that's consistent throughout the site. So please don't try and override WordPress's jQuery. Our site is starting to come along really well. All we need to do is make it more dynamic. Before we can do this, we need to have some dummy content set up. So let's add some dummy content. Navigate to the dashboard and let's add a new plugin. Search for the plugin called wordpress. This plugin generates dummy content for us. So install it and activate it. Alright, so once activated, you will see a new menu item pop up called wordpress. Under it, click Posts. This will allow us to generate some posts. In the quantity, put 6 and 12. Scroll down to Featured Image Rate and set it to 100. Leave the rest of the fields as is and click Generate. This may take a while for some of you. If we go to our posts, you should now see some generated posts. We don't need to generate any more content from wordpress for now. Let's create one page called About Us. Insert a few words and then publish it. Lastly, let's create a menu. The menu page should be right under Appearance, but you'll notice that it's unavailable to us. This is because we need to tell WordPress that our theme supports menus. Let's learn how to do this in the next lecture. I'm currently looking at a function called add theme support on WordPress's codex. I'll provide a link to it in the resources section of this lecture. Let's take a look at what WordPress has to say about it. Allows the theme or plugin to register support of a certain theme feature. If called from a theme, it should be done in the themes functions.php file to work. WordPress comes with some features that we can take advantage of right out of the box. It is possible and allowed for us to create our own version of these features, but that's beyond the scope of this course. It's also not very common practice to do this, even in commercial themes. So one of these features is called menus. All we have to do is call this function and pass in the menus argument, and WordPress will activate the menus feature. As instructed, let's open up our functions file and call this function and pass in the string menus under the setup section of our file. You'll also notice from the docs that there's a second argument that allows you to specify certain options that come with each feature. However, we'll be fine with the default settings. If you're curious about the various options available, then read up on the documentation to learn more about them. Save your file and then go to WordPress's dashboard. You'll now notice that we have menus under Appearance showing up. Before we can create a menu though, we have to let WordPress know where the menu will be placed in our theme. We're making great progress so far. Let's start displaying our menus now. Just like scripts and styles, we need to register our menu first before displaying it. Let's do that now. In the resources section of this lecture, I provide a link to the register nav menu function. Open that link and let's take a look at how to use it. As you can see, there's only two required parameters, which is the location and a short description. The location can be thought of as a special ID. If we scroll down further, you can see WordPress provides an example. In this example, WordPress uses an action hook called after setup theme. This hook is called when WordPress has initialized our theme and is ready for modifications by either plugins or our own theme. Let's go back to our functions file and use this action. So, right under our hooks section, let's call this hook, and the function we want to call is ju_setup_theme. Now, we need to create this function. Let's create a file called setup.php in the includes folder. The reason we aren't creating this file in the front folder is because some of the functions we'll be using here will be applied to both the front end and the back end. Let's include this file. Then let's call creator function. Alright, now we can register a menu. Let's call the register nav menu function and pass in a location and a description. I'm going to call this menu primary and give it a simple description of primary menu. Before I continue, I'm going to wrap my description in a function that doesn't really have a proper name, but it's called by typing 2 underscores. This function is a special function created by WordPress. It allows for text to be translated into various languages. We haven't gone over translations yet, but I'll give you a quick rundown. WordPress comes with various functions for translating strings. The 2 underscore function is just one of the most commonly used ones. When we start talking about translations, I'll show you the various functions available. For now, let's focus on this one function. This function has 2 parameters. The first parameter is the string you would like to translate. The second parameter is the text domain this translation is using. Earlier, we talked about text domains when we created our file header. The text domain is basically the name of your theme folder, in our case, Udemy. So what does the text domain actually do? Well, first of all, your theme won't be the only file that has translations. Users might have various plugins activated with their own translations. You can think of a text domain as an ID. If we pass in our text domain, WordPress will know we want to use a translation from our theme and not some other plugin loaded. After all, primary menu is a phrase that can be used throughout our site. Anyway, we actually haven't created a translation file and we won't be doing it so right now. If WordPress doesn't find a translation, then WordPress just won't translate the string and just return the original string. You don't have to translate every string, but I highly recommend it so your plugin can be used by the widest audience possible. Alright, that's it for now. If you didn't understand, that's fine. I'll be going more in depth in a future lecture. Now that we've registered our menu, let's display it. In the resources section of this lecture, I've included a link to the function called wp-nav-menu. Let's take a look at it. As you can see, WordPress has thoroughly documented this function. It's very powerful and flexible. We won't be going over every bit here since we don't need to use all the options available for us for our theme. Basically, what this function does is generate a menu for us and outputs it onto wherever we call it. So let's do that. Open up your index template and let's call this function in the nav tags. Specifically, you want to find our original static menu and delete it like so. Next, open up some PHP tags and call the function wp nav menu. This function can be called as is and WordPress will just use its default settings, but we don't want that. We have some things we would like to specify. This function only has one parameter, which is an array. So let's create an array, and then in this array, our first item will be theme location. This key's value should be the location name we used in the register nav menu function. The name of the menu we registered was called primary, so this key's value should be primary. Next, let's define the container. The container is simply a tag that is wrapped around our navigation's HTML. WordPress will generate the HTML for our menu. The HTML generated is simply UL and LI tags, or simply known as an unordered list. The container key simply asks if we want to wrap this unordered list with a div or nav tag. Depending on your needs, you can use either. However, our theme is using Bootstrap and we already have our navigation wrapped in a div tag, so we don't want either. So let's just pass in false. Therefore, WordPress won't wrap our unordered list with a div or nav tag. Lastly, because we're using Bootstrap, we want WordPress to add a few classes to our unordered list. So we have to use the menu underscore class key. This key's value is list of class names we want to add to our menu. If you have multiple classes, then you just separate them with spaces. In our case, we have two classes called nav and navbar-nav. These classes are specific to Bootstrap. Your navigation menu may differ if you build your theme with a different CSS framework, so don't think this parameter is actually required. That's it. Now, if we refresh our page, it won't work as expected. This is because we actually haven't created a menu yet. Let's do that now. In our WordPress dashboard, go to Appearance, Menus, and then Create a Menu. Take quick notice of the Menu Settings section. You'll see that there's a subsection called Theme Location. This lists all the theme locations we registered in our setup file. Let's assign this menu to the primary menu. I'm only going to have the About page assigned to this menu. If we save our menu, you'll notice our About menu item being generated properly. You can click this if you like and it will work, but it won't display the content. We'll fix that very soon. Before I end this lecture, I want you to take note of one thing. In the WordPress's menu page, you'll see WordPress outputted the phrase primary menu for our theme location. Earlier, I told you about translations and how they're performed. WordPress acknowledged that this phrase can be translated and tried to translate it. Since we don't have any translation set, WordPress then outputted the string as is. I just wanted you to notice that. As this course progresses, we'll be creating multiple templates. Keep in mind that our index template is just the default template WordPress uses when there isn't a suitable template to be found. Our theme should be consistent, and so therefore our headers and footers should look the same. Our templates can get pretty big if we just copy and paste our header and footers. It'd also be a pain to have to edit each template every time we made a change to our header or our footer. Luckily, WordPress provides a solution by offering two functions for including our headers and footers. Let's create the required files first. First, we have to create a file called header.php in our themes folder. It's very important that you give our file this name, as this is the name WordPress will search for when trying to include your header. From the index template, let's cut everything from the doc tag to the closing nav tags and then paste it into the header file. Next, let's create a footer.php file. Just like before, we are forced to name it this by WordPress. From the index template, cut everything from the bottom of the file to opening tag of the footer tag. Then paste it into the footer file. Alright, now all we have to do is include our files. At the very top of the index template, call the function get_header. This function will look for a file called header.php and include it. At the very bottom of our file, call the function get_footer. Just like the header function, this function will look for a file called footer.php. Let's refresh our page and see if everything is working properly. If you see no errors, that means you did everything right. Before I wrap up this lecture, I want you to be aware we're not completely forced to name our files header.php and footer.php. Let's say we have a header called header v2.php and we want to use this header for post templates specifically. Well, all you have to do is pass in the name v2 and WordPress will then search for a file called header-v2.php. Don't worry about prepending the word header or appending the extension .php. WordPress takes care of this for you. This way you can actually have various headers. These same rules apply to the getFooter function. For this course, we'll only have one header and footer, so we don't need to pass in anything to these functions. Our theme has one widget area, which is the sidebar. Themes usually have widget areas in the footer as well, but our theme is pretty simple, so we won't bother creating a widget area for the footer. However, if you feel like creating one for the footer anyway, then the process is basically the same. Alright, so right now I'm looking at a function called register_sidebar. As usual, check out the resources section of this lecture for the link. If you look at the very short description, WordPress recommends that we use this function in the widgets_init action hook. So let's do that. In our functions file, let's add this hook under the hooks section and let's call our function ju_widgets. Next, let's create a file in the includes folder called widgets.php and include it from our functions file. Lastly, let's define the function. Now, we can create widget areas for our theme. Let's take a look at the WordPress documentation for the register_sidebar function. There's only one parameter and it's optional. It takes in an array. Let's go by this one by one in our functions file. So let's call this function and pass it an array. The first parameter is the name of the sidebar. The name should be readable, short, and concise. I'll be using the double_ function like last time since I want to allow users to translate this name if needed. I'm going to simply call it my first theme sidebar. The second key we can set is the ID. We must set an ID or WordPress will throw an error. Before we set the ID, let's go to the codex for a second. Scroll down to the notes and I want you to look at the very first note. WordPress warns us of IDs we should avoid and provides a link of IDs not to use. So let's take a quick look and as you can see, the list is pretty exhaustive. Let's go back to our widget file and let's give our widget a unique ID. One way of making sure we have a unique ID is to prefix our ID with initials like we do with our functions. I'm going to give my sidebar the ID ju_sidebar. Next is a simple description. I'm going to make this translatable and set it to sidebar for the theme Udemy. I'm going to leave the class empty as I don't want to apply any classes. There are a couple more things we should be doing, but I just want to make sure our widgets are working. So let's refresh our page and we should get no errors. Let's go to our WordPress dashboard and you should see a new menu item appear under Appearance called Widgets. Let's check it out quickly. As you can see, WordPress now has created a nice little UI for our sidebar. It takes care of saving and updating our sidebar. Right now, our sidebar is empty, so let's drag and drop some widgets onto our sidebar. After doing so, let's take a look at our site. You'll notice that our widgets aren't loading. This is because we haven't called the function for displaying them. Before we do that, let's separate our sidebar from our template. Just like the header and the footer, sidebars can be put in their own files and be called with the function get_sidebar. The rules for names apply to this function as well. So let's create a file called sidebar.php. Next, let's completely remove all HTML between the aside tags in our template. Then, let's call the get_sidebar function. Open up the sidebar file and before we can display it, we have to check if it's active. Inside an if statement, let's call the isActiveSidebar function. This function does exactly what we need it to do. Check if our sidebar is active. You simply pass in the name of the sidebar. In our case, this would be the ID of the sidebar we created, which is ju_sidebar. Inside this conditional statement, if it returns true, we'll call a function called dynamic_sidebar, which will take care of displaying our sidebar. The only thing we have to pass it is the ID of our sidebar, which is JU_sidebar. If we did everything right, we should now see our new sidebar appear on our page. Great. Well, not so much, because the HTML outputted doesn't really go well with our theme. Let's fix this in the next lecture. So, let's format the sidebars correctly. This is going to be a bit tricky, because we'll have to insert HTML in weird spots because of the limits placed on us. Let's take a look at the codex and learn more about the register sidebar function. There are 4 more keys we can set. They are the before_widget, after_widget, before_title, and after_title keys. These keys allow us to inject HTML into our sidebars. As each name states, it'll insert HTML at some point of each widget created. I'm going to pause the video for a bit and fill out these keys. Alright, now I want you to copy what I have. For the most part, nothing in here is really special. This is just regular HTML with some classes to make our widgets look pretty. It can look a bit confusing because there are so many opening and closing tags. Widget areas are a bit tricky to create if you create widget areas with so many classes and tags. So when you're designing your site, try and keep the HTML for widgets fairly minimal. I was able to create this through trial and error. The only thing I want you to focus on is the before_widget. You'll notice that I have these random sets of characters in the class and ID attributes. These attributes are a bit special because this tag is the container tag for the whole widget. You can think of these random characters as placeholders. There are some widgets out there that might want to add their own classes and set their own ID. By providing these characters, we allow for third-party widgets to do this. We don't have to do anything else. Now let's refresh our homepage and see what our widgets look like now. If yours looks anything like mine, then you're on the right track. There's only one problem now. Our search widget, it doesn't fit with the rest of our theme. Let's fix this.